Okay. Welcome everyone to our June meeting. And first off on the announcements, as all of you guys are here tonight are aware, we are trying out the second Tuesday of the month instead of the second Friday of the month for our meetings. So we're going to give this a shot for the remainder of the year to see kind of how things work out, how people like it, how people don't like it. Um, Trying something new. And then an idea for this is, hey, if we find that Tuesday night generally works pretty well for people, it may give us a better shot at finding a nice location to get back in person as well. Since Tuesdays are a little bit lower kind of demand for a lot of locations for hosting things rather than a Friday night. So we figured we'll give this a shot, and hopefully then, if it works out well, we can find a good location that we can do kind of hybrid meetings. So for those that want to join in person, we'll have that. And then for people that want to join remotely, hopefully we'll then still have a good network connection so we can stream the meetings as well so that we can kind of get the best of both worlds. That is announcement number one. The next announcement, mentioned this at the last meeting, but the Monterey shootout is happening again, finally, after a big hiatus with COVID. It is August 23rd through the 25th, and registration is live on the Monterey Shootout website. The easiest way to get there is probably through the Backscatter website, or if you just kind of search Monterey Shootout. A couple other things. Mini comp. So after the presentation, we'll have our monthly mini comp. The theme this month is pink. So for Breast Cancer Awareness Month, we decided to go with that. And while you do have to be a member to submit, anyone that's here is welcome to vote. So feel free to stick around. Then for the next kind of upcoming meetings for mini comp themes, in July it's going to be Reef. In August will be portraits, and then in September, schools for back to school. And then one final announcement before we get into the show, which is on the sadder side of things. Unfortunately, our longtime member, Patty Ba, passed away last week, I believe it was. So sad to hear that. Helga let me
Monday
know
the
about that.
3rd.
What was that, Helga?
She passed Monday the 3rd.
Okay. So sad, certainly sad to hear. She was a wonderful person and some phenomenal photography as well that she had. So condolences to her family. And with that, we'll get into the feature presentation for tonight. So we'll welcome Kat to talk about blackwater diving.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen. Cool. Everyone can see this, right?
Yep, it's coming through.
Okay, sweet. So I'm Kat, and I'm here to talk a little bit about my favorite kind of underwater photography, which is blackwater photography. I know blackwater diving photography has gained a lot of popularity over the past few years, and there's a lot of new operators for this kind of diving popping up all over the globe, which I think is really exciting. But even if you've never heard of blackwater diving before, I'm here to basically give an overview about what it is, how it's done, and then share critters and photography tips. So very quickly, a little bit of background on myself. I'm a nature photographer, a hobbyist based out of San Francisco. I love all forms of nature photography. I do a mix of underwater, wildlife, and landscapes, but underwater is by far my favorite. And within underwater photography, my favorite type to do actually is blackwater photography. So I'm really looking forward to getting to share this passion with all of you. The blackwater diving community in South Florida is actually a large part of how I got into underwater photography to start with. I visited Florida a lot when I was first starting out, and there's a very talented group of blackwater photographers there who also are skilled in all sorts of other types of underwater photography. And so they really took me under their wing and taught me a lot of what I know today. So I owe a lot of where I am now to blackwater diving as a whole and the community around it. So I'm really excited to get to highlight it and share some blackwater diving photography here. So here's a little look at what I'm going to cover. So I will give an overview on blackwater diving, what it is and how it's done. I'm going to share the camera setup I use and the settings that I shoot with. And then I want to talk about some types of blackwater critters and lots of fun facts and critter spotlights. And then I want to give some time at the end for Q&A. So all the blackwater photos in this presentation are photos that I took, but I do want to preface this by saying that I am not trained as a marine biologist or a scientist, but I do research most of the critters that I see, and I try to understand them as much as I can. So I will try to answer any questions that anyone might have to the best of my ability during the Q&A. So I know different people might have differing levels of familiarity with blackwater diving and photography. So I'm going to start by going into a little bit of detail on what blackwater diving is and how it's done. So essentially, blackwater diving is a type of scuba dive that is done over deep water at night. And what makes this special really comes down to this phenomenon where the largest synchronous migration in the world in terms of biomass actually happens every single night in the ocean. And this is called diel vertical migration. This migration is led by massive amounts of zooplankton, which are, they serve as a major food source for many marine animals. And during the day, zooplankton live in the deep ocean, but at night they actually move to the surface. And the reason for this move is because zooplankton feed on phytoplankton. And these are microscopic marine plants that only live near the surface. But to hide from their own predators during the day, the zooplankton will spend the day in the deep ocean where there's no light. And at sunset, they move to the surface where they can feed on the phytoplankton, which are still at the surface, while a lot of their own predators are asleep. So of course, not all of their predators are asleep. And so there are many things that feed on zooplankton that live deep as well. And this migration in turn draws all of those predators toward the surface as well. So basically what this all means is that if we scuba dive over deep water at night, even when we're near the surface, we're able to see many critters that might live hundreds of feet deep during the day. So I just talked a lot about plankton, but I didn't really describe exactly what they are. And so the definition of a plankton is an organism that has either limited or total lack of ability for propulsion. And because of this limited movement, they basically drift along with ocean currents, and they go wherever the current takes them. So the two types of plankton are zooplankton and phytoplankton, which, as just mentioned, are the drivers of diel vertical migration. On blackwater dives, a lot of what we're seeing is different kinds of plankton. And some critters, such as jellyfish, for example, are planktonic their whole lives. But there's also other things like corals and anemones, some mollusks, some crustaceans. They're planktonic only in their larval stage, and then they'll settle when they become adults. We might see many stages of the same critter show up, from larval to even sometimes adults. So what is needed for blackwater diving? Well, first, we need a boat because we need to get out to where there's deep water. Locations that have a steep drop-off close to shore tend to be generally good candidates for where you might try blackwater diving. Next is a good light setup. So most blackwater operators have a floating ball with a rope hanging down under it, and lights are usually placed every 10 to 15 feet, usually down to about 60 feet. And so this downline will drift in the current. It's free floating. And these lights will attract plankton to them, which in turn attracts other critters that might feed on the plankton. The brighter the lights, usually the more plankton it attracts, and the higher the chances you might have of seeing something rare. Some operators have like over 100,000 lumens of light on their downlines. The lights also act as a reference point for divers, so you don't get lost out in the middle of nowhere at night. I try to take a photo here of the downline on my last blackwater trip. And I know it's not super clear, but it kind of shows what it might look like underwater when you're looking at it as a point of reference. So once the lights are set up, then you're good to grab your camera and jump in. And essentially you spend your dive swimming around the downline. You can wander off if you want, but the idea is not to get too far out of your sight so you don't get lost. It's pretty much possible to find unique critters anywhere in the water column, even at the surface. So usually what I do is I'll start my dive down at the bottom of the line and then work my way up. And the way to look for critters is to scan the water column in front of you with a torch as you swim around. Most blackwater critters are pretty small, but with a little practice, you'll start to recognize how the different critters move. And from a distance, even when you can't see exactly what it is, you'll be able to tell what might be something interesting because of the way it moves and how that correlates to things around it, whether it's something different or not. Blackwater diving is very unpredictable because what you see is so driven by currents, which can always be changing. Like you can be in the same spot 2 nights in a row and see completely different things. One night it might be totally dead, and one night you might get a lot of very rare encounters. So it does take a lot of patience, and it's not for everyone. But for people who like macro critters and are willing to deal with slow dives here and there, I think the patience is worth it. And to me, a lot of times the unpredictability really adds to the excitement because you never know what can show up. And so you might have also heard the term bonfire diving, which is pretty similar to blackwater diving. This photo is obviously a joke, but bonfire diving is when you set a bunch of lights down on the ocean floor and then you dive around that like a little bonfire. The lights, same way, they'll attract the plankton and other critters this way. But this can be done in shallow water. It can be, I mean, it has to be done in shallow water. It can be done as a shore dive in some places. Some operators actually use the term bonfire diving just to refer to blackwater diving close to shore, but they still use a downline on a floating ball. But because of those differences in depth, there's still different critters that can show up. So really depending on logistics and where you are, you might want to choose to do one versus the other, or you might want to do both because you can get different types of animals that you see. Quick look at camera setup. Like with any kind of photography, there's many different kinds of cameras you can use. There's pros and cons to each one. There's a lot of options for blackwater photography, and even the Olympus TG compact cameras can take really incredible blackwater photos and videos. But as an overview, I'll talk through what gear I use and why. My camera is the Nikon D850. I've just had that for years. I haven't changed to mirrorless. And I like the D850 because it has really good low light focus, which is good for blackwater. For lens choice, you generally want a short macro lens that can focus really quickly and close to the lens. The Nikon 60mm macro is kind of the standard for blackwater diving for this because it's a short lens and it focuses very quickly. It's pretty much useless in every other scenario. I don't use it for like regular macro diving. But the reason you want a short lens here in blackwater specifically is because a lot of these critters move very quickly and very erratically, and you want to be able to basically get them as quickly, like focus as quickly and as close to the lens as possible so that you can easily keep them in frame, which is a little bit harder if you're using like a 105 or a 90mm macro. For people using mirrorless cameras, though, there are different lens recommendations depending specifically on what camera you're using. Some people are actually using this lens who shoot Sony. You can use this lens on an adapter. Some people are using the 90mm with a 1.4 teleconverter. Some people just try, Canon shooters tend to just use the Canon 90mm. And then some people are actually getting good results now using like a 28-60 inside the Nauticam WWL wet lens, which is also getting decent results. It depends on the autofocus of the camera, and it's not just all Sony cameras use this. It really depends which camera you're using. But yeah, it just might take a little practice of getting used to, as it would with any setup. Strobes, I use ion-on strobes just because that's what I own. They're obviously not the most powerful strobes on the market, but I find that they do work very well for blackwater. It is possible to do blackwater photography with one strobe, but you generally want, obviously, the more light, the better. And some people I see even using 3 with one of them in slave mode. The video lights that I have on top, these are very important because these are basically how you find critters. There are some places like in NLL, for example, you get a private dive guide to find critters for you. But in some other places, for example, Florida, you're kind of on, you're not diving around with a private guide unless you specifically hire one. So it's good to be able to find your own critters. The 2 lights on top, one is set to flood mode, for me, at least, in order to focus, and one is set to spot mode, which I use to actually search for critters. This light I use is the Big Blue VTL 8000P Max. This light in particular, I highly recommend for blackwater. It's really good because the battery lasts more than 2 hours on full flood power, which is very useful because some operators, for example, in Florida, your blackwater dives can be up to 2 hours long. So you want something that lasts the whole time. You don't want to have to go up and switch batteries. And in places like NLL, sometimes you're doing 2 1-hour dives in a row. So you could technically switch your batteries in the middle, but still easier to have something that just lasts the whole time. This particular light, it has an 8,000 lumen flood mode and a 2,600 lumen spot. And also important is that it has a red light mode that's 500 lumens. A lot of the smaller lights only have a 100 lumen red light. And for Blackwater specifically, a strong red light can come in very handy because there's some critters that will flee if you point white light at them. But if you switch to red, they can't really see it very well. And so they'll stop and they won't move around as much, which makes them a lot easier to photograph. So with these two together, they're each 500 lumens. I get 1,000 lumens of red light, which helps a lot with the focusing. The Nauticam MWL1 that I have sticking out the bottom here is a wet lens that converts the 60 millimeter macro into a fisheye. I don't use this very often. It's usually flipped down all the way under the camera when I'm swimming around. But I have it there in case something big shows up because, for example, in Florida, we've seen like on blackwater dives, we've gotten thresher sharks like mola mola, blue marlin. You never really know what might show up. In places like Anilau, where you might get 6-foot blanket octopus, it's useful to have that kind of flexibility. The reason I have it mounted so it flips downward instead of upward is because it'll get in the way of the focus lights if it flips upward. And on blackwater dives where you don't have a bottom, it's not gonna be in the way if it's flipped down. And then this is all very heavy underwater. So to save myself from wrist pain, I use the Stix large float ring, which is tied around the macro port. And it gets caught by the wet lenses, so it doesn't go anywhere. My jump settings are here. This really does vary a lot from person to person, and you'll have to play around with what works best for you. But I've found that shooting f/29 gives a good mix of depth and field and not having to turn my strobes up too high. I shoot at 1/250th just because everything is generally moving very quickly. So you do want to try to hit your sync speed. And I generally leave my ISO at 400. My strobes, I start with 1/3 power, and this is what I adjust the most, depending on what the critter is, how reflective it is, or how dark it is. I'll usually adjust my strobes up and down. And again, there's a lot of amazing blackwater photographers who use different settings. I do want to mention, I do tend to shoot blackwater underexposed and then bring out brightness in post-processing. And there's 3 reasons I can recommend doing that. The first is that you'll find some critters, for example, some fish and some cephalopods have really reflective eyes. So if you shoot normal exposure for the body, the eyes tend to get blown out. 2 is that having my strobes on lower power by being underexposed allows them to refresh a lot faster, so you can get more shots in a row. This might not be as big of an issue if you have more powerful strobes. And the third reason is for people who plan on entering competitions, depending on the visibility where you are, there might be a lot of particulate in the water. So shooting underexposed will make your background darker, so you don't see a bunch of backscatter in the raw file, which is useful for competitions where if you're obviously submitting the raw, you don't want it to look like there's a bunch of snow, unless that's the look you're looking for. Some people do specifically try to get that snow globe backscatter effect. So it depends on your creative vision, but I generally shoot underexposed. Okay, so now for the fun stuff. I'm going to go over some of the kinds of zooplankton and critters that we can see on blackwater dives. And I could spend hours talking about all the different critters, but I'm going to try to present a few general categories over the next few slides with some examples. This first category I call jelly-like, which basically I use to refer to anything with a gelatinous body. So this includes things like jellyfish, hydroids, siphonophores, tunicates, just to name a few. A lot of these things do stink, so it is good to keep your body covered on blackwater dives. From a classification standpoint, the term jellyfish only refers to one particular class of organism. And so some of the things that we might think look like jellyfish, such as box jellies or some hydroids, are actually not considered true jellyfish. So that's why I'm using the term here, jelly-like, to be a little bit more encompassing. There's also, of course, things that are jelly-like that don't look like jellyfish. There are such as siphonophores and some planktonic tunicates, such as pyrosomes here and salps. Siphonophores, like this one on the bottom right, they have these long stinging tentacles that they can extend and retract. So here they're all retracted. When they're swimming around, they tend to retract them. When you find them, they tend to be extended and just hanging out in one spot. But shining a light on them tends to make them retract their tentacles and run away. Siphonophores are actually not a single organism. They are a colony of different organisms that all live together. The most famous example of a siphonophore, which many people might mistake for a jellyfish, is actually the Portuguese man-of-war. And then planktonic tunicates, such as salps and pyrosomes, they also can form huge colonies and sometimes can be many, many feet long, but these do not sting. One of the things that I love about blackwater photography is that there's so many different interesting behaviors that you can see. And it's kind of exciting to see how all of these different critters interact with each other. So this example here of this jack with a jellyfish, sometimes you'll see fish swimming along with jellyfish in this symbiotic relationship where the fish actually use the jellies as protection. And at the same time, they push the jellyfish around as they're swimming in the water. And this helps the jellyfish as well because it helps it find food faster than it would if it was swimming around on its own. Because with the fish pushing it, it can move a lot faster. So this is just an overview of a few jelly-like critters. This category as a whole is probably the most common thing you'll see on blackwater dives, and probably one of the least interesting overall, but they are all over the place. And so once you learn to see how the jellyfish move, you'll see very quickly when something is not a jellyfish. It's moving very differently. So the next category is crustaceans. This is also another very, very commonly prolifically seen on blackwater dives. This includes things like shrimps, crabs, lobsters, amphipods. You actually probably will see these more than jellyfish. You'll have a lot of amphipods trying to swim into your ears most of the time. They really are attracted to the lights. Crustaceans have actually multiple larval stages and also post-larval stages before they develop into adults. So you might see multiple stages of the same species on a dive. So on the left here, you'll see photos of one of the larval stages of a crab, which some people colloquially refer to as the stick form. And there's also the megalopus stage down here, which is a post-larval stage, and they swim around curled up in a ball. There are a lot of different species of shrimps. You will see adult shrimps as well. You can see this one here as eggs. So this is an adult. And larval lobsters are also very common. Here is a larval slipper lobster. They're almost translucent. They're very flat, and they're often seen holding on to siphonophores or jellyfish, which they use partly as propulsion so that they can relax while the jellies kind of swim around. And they also slowly eat them while they're hitching a ride. So they have food and a vehicle altogether. This one here I found holding on to 4 different siphonophores. So it'll probably be set on food for a while. But sometimes you might see them with even more than that or with just a few. I do want to do a quick spotlight on one of my favorite crustaceans, which is the phronema. These are parasites. They find basically a salp of some sort, and they hollow out the inside. And then after they hollow out the inside, they lay their eggs inside it. And when the babies hatch, you can see them. They generally like form the circle inside around their mother. And then until they get big enough, like here, these ones are about to leave. Then they go off on their own. Supposedly, this is the animal that the movie Alien was based off of. They're not super rare, but they are always fun to see. And they're a little creepy. And I like kind of critters like that. So they definitely fit the bill. So speaking of creepy critters, next up is marine worms. There are a lot of kinds of marine worms. You will see a lot of these as well. They also are very attracted to lights. If you stay one place, like this is one of the critters that you might get bombarded by, which you might have experienced doing other sorts of night dives as well. There is a cool behavior I've seen. I have not been able to photograph it, where some species of polychaete worm, these segmented worms, they release a green bioluminescent ink. It's unclear exactly why. It might be as a defense mechanism, but sometimes when they swim around, you'll see them release ink out of their bodies that glows green afterwards, or blue sometimes. Yeah, I have not been able to personally catch it on camera. So next up is anemones and corals. The larval stages of anemones look usually like gummy candies. They don't move around too much. And sometimes you'll see critters like amphipods hitching a ride on them. To go from their gummy candy form to their more elongated form where they start growing tentacles, like here, the larval tube anemone, they actually do exercise of a sort. So they behave like these little hydraulic pumps where they take in water and they regulate their body pressure using muscle activity. If there's too much or too little muscle activity, it affects their shape, just like with our muscles. So while we exercise using a skeleton of muscles and bones, anemones use a hydroskeleton using muscles and this water-filled cavity inside of them. And you also see coral polyps around. Here there's a photo of a larval filefish holding onto a coral polyp. Adult filefish are all like on the reef. Adult filefish are often seen holding onto corals or sponges at night so that they don't drift away. Well, it's possibly to prevent them from drifting away. This is not completely understood, but that's one of the theories. And so this behavior seems to be something they actually develop in their larval stages. As larval filefish, we often find them on blackwater dives grabbing onto something like, for example, here, the coral polyp, or jellyfish, or anemone larva. They've even been seeing, well, there's a photo someone else posted once of one of these holding on to a living seahorse drifting in the water column. So you never know where you're going to find them on. Another spotlight on the phenomenon of hitchhiking. So we've seen a little of this over the past few slides, such as the larval lobster grabbing onto the siphonophores or the amphipod on the last slide riding on the anemone. It's actually quite common to see this behavior from crustaceans, such as shrimp. They're often seen riding on jellies, likely for a similar reason to the lobsters. They use them both as propulsion and as food. And then outside of crustaceans, another really big rider is the nautilus, so type of octopus. And these are often seen riding on salps, jellyfish, sea butterflies. They sometimes even ride on one another. And when this behavior was first described, researchers assumed that it was due to transportation or depredation, so similar to what the shrimps and the lobsters were doing. But it actually is a little bit different. There was a particular specimen that was captured in the Philippines in 1992. And it showed that the nautilus had actually cut 2 holes on the bell of the jellyfish that it was riding. And it was essentially sucking the jellyfish's food out of the jellyfish's gastric cavity and eating it itself. So this is actually like a different form of parasitism than what the lobsters are doing. They've also been seen the nautilus. They've also been seen steering and directing their chariots toward other sources of food to help themselves get there faster. And if they feel threatened, they'll also use the jellyfish stingers as a defense mechanism by throwing those tentacles out in front of them. So that brings us to the cephalopods, which is always a crowd favorite and probably a lot of the reason why a lot of blackwater photographers do blackwater diving is to photograph different kinds of cephalopods. It's always a highlight to see one of these. And depending on where you are in the world, you may see a lot of different species of squid and octopus and argonauts. So Anilao in the Philippines specifically is really known as a cephalopod hotspot. While I was there recently, we saw paper nautilus and wonderpuss on pretty much every single dive. So there's also there's also usually a lot of squid around, but they're pretty much anywhere you go blackwater diving, there's probably going to be squid, but they move very quickly. They're not always the easiest to photograph. So of course we can't talk about blackwater cephalopods without a spotlight on one of the species that I think really draws a lot of people, including myself, to blackwater diving, and that's the blanket octopus. So I actually got these photos back in February of this year, so I'm super excited to get to share them. Blanket octopuses have the largest size discrepancy between males and females in the whole animal kingdom. Adult females can get up to 6 feet long, while males remain at about 2.4 centimeters, which is 1 inch. Only the females have this cape that they're named after. The males actually look similar to juvenile females, but they stay looking like a juvenile their entire lives. They never actually like fully mature. The cape is thought to help make the octopus look bigger, so to help it deter predators. And while they also have ink for their defense, like other octopus, they also can detach part of their capes. So I think the idea there is to confuse predators, where they're hoping the predator goes after the cape while the octopus can swim to safety. Like all octopuses, they can change color very rapidly, and they can also furl and unfurl their blankets as they swim. So the top left photo here is of a juvenile female, but the other 3 are actually of the same adult female, and they're taken only a few minutes apart. So you can really see how quickly they change their color and their shape. They're also immune to the sting of the Portuguese man-of-war. And both males and female juveniles will actually steal the stinging tentacles of Portuguese man-of-war and attach them to their suckers and swim around with them for defense. So you can see here on the top left, this octopus, it's actually carrying some tentacles around. These are not its own tentacles. Those are the Portuguese man-of-war. And this is also something to be careful of. If you see them, these blanket octopus, they can sting you because of the stingers. So other than cephalopods, there's many other species of mollusks that we can encounter. So pelagic nudibranchs, sea butterflies, sea angels, sea elephants, these are all names for different kinds of mollusks that you might find on blackwater dives. A lot of these don't move very much, which makes them a little bit easier to photograph. And they can be often seen mating or with eggs. So mating seems to be coordinated, like with many other species. Some nights you might see multiple mating pairs just all next to each other. In one night, the one that I photographed this, I think I counted 5 mating pairs of different species of sea butterflies and sea elephants. So this one here on the left is a sea elephant. They're called that because they have this trunk-like appendage coming out the top. And the sea butterflies are called that because they have these wings and they flap their wings like a butterfly when they swim around. So another category that contains many species that people want to photograph is larval fishes. So a lot of fish are like reverse ugly ducklings. So they have all these frills and tutus and appendages in their larval stages that they lose when they become adults. In the case of flounders, for example, here the larval spot fin flounder, they're in their larval stage, their eyes are both on opposite sides of their head because they're pelagic when they're larvae. When they settle as adults and settle onto the ocean floor, that's when their eyes migrate to both be on one side of their head. So in this next section, I'm going to share a comparison of larval versus adult versions of some of the fish that we see, as well as some fun facts about them. All of the larval fish photos I'm going to show are taken in Florida while blackwater diving in the Gulf Stream. So this can bring up a lot of cool deep sea critters. So first up is the tripod fish. They're very colorful, very frilly during their larval stage, but you can see when they get to their adult stage where the name tripod fish actually comes from. The shot on the right is taken by the Schmidt Ocean Institute on a remotely operated vehicle. And as adults, they live at depths from between 3,000 to 15,000 feet. And the eyes have basically almost disappeared because they don't really need to see very much at that depth. But they use these really long modified fins that make this tripod to basically perch on the seafloor. And then they have their pectoral fins, which they raise up, so like antenna. And they use these to actually detect prey that swims by. They mostly eat zooplankton and other small organisms. And they pretty much actually spend their whole lives just perching like this on the seafloor and waiting for food to pass by. When food does pass by, they use these pectoral fins again, kind of like hands, to bring the food into their mouths. But very different from the behavior of the larval stage, which kind of just swims around and flaps. Cusk eels here, these are interesting because a lot of them have external guts in their larval stage. So this big protrusion you see here on the left is actually its stomach. If you look closely, you can see the shape of the guts. It's thought that the reason this is external is, one, to help them absorb nutrients from the surrounding water. But I think it's also a form of mimicry where it kind of makes them look like a siphonophore. So this would deter potential predators thinking that they sting as well, even though they don't, because they look like a siphonophore. The adult photo on the right is a species of the same genus. It was also filmed by a remotely operated vehicle in the Central Pacific. These are usually found about 2,600 to 5,200 feet, so not quite as big of a range as the tripod fish. Larval anglerfish are also very interesting because almost all of them have their bodies encased in this jelly-like bubble, and they lose this bubble as they mature. It's not totally understood why this bubble is there. There's other species that have similar behavior as a larval stage. So for example, pancake batfish also are in a bubble in their larval stage. You can see in this photo that's also starting to develop is lyra on the top of its head. So this is a female because male anglerfish are teeny tiny and don't have lyres. You may have heard that in many species of deep sea anglerfish, the males are essentially parasites, where they find a female and they bite onto her. And upon doing so, they release an enzyme that basically digests their own mouth and part of their body, and it fuses the two of them together. They're fused down to the blood vessel level, and then the male will essentially rely on the female to survive and just turns into a pair of gonads that are attached to her body. While some species of anglerfish have one male fused to each female, there's been female anglers seen in some species with up to 8 pairs of gonads fused on their bodies, so they mate with multiple males. However, not all anglerfish reproduce this way. In this particular genus in this photo, the males are free swimming and they're not parasitic. And this is the second time that this anglerfish has ever been photographed. It's interesting because in Florida, a lot of times, like, we'll see something that's never been seen before, and then all of a sudden we see it like many weeks in a row, and then it might disappear again. So it's really hard to predict what might show up in the Gulf Stream. And last but certainly not least is the telescope fish. Now, this blackwater photo on the left is not a good photo. This thing was running away from me as fast as it could and was going directly toward the surface. So it didn't slow down even when I turned on red light. And I looked at it, I didn't think it was very interesting. So I chose not to chase it up to the surface. And it wasn't until I got back on the boat that my friends told me what it was, which is a larval telescope fish. And the species had apparently only been seen alive on 2 other occasions. So of course I beat myself up afterwards for not spending more time with it. But honestly, their larval form is not really very interesting to start with. What's more interesting is their adult form, which is this on the right. This is from the Smithsonian Institute. And the issue, though, is that they've never been seen alive as an adult. And the only specimens that have been obtained were basically accidentally fished up in nets and were dead. So this may not be like completely what they look like when they're alive. This is a dead specimen. But it should give a general idea of what they do look like. They live between 4,200 to 10,000 feet deep, and their eyes, as you can see, are very large. They're adapted for binocular vision at the expense of lateral vision. And this, it's thought that this is in order for them to be able to see bioluminescent prey from relatively far away. And they also have really huge mouths relative to their head size. And they have extensible jaws that allow them to swallow food that's even bigger than they are. They also have a very highly expandable stomach to match that. In deep water, you never really know where your next meal will come from. So it's really beneficial for them to be able to eat as much as possible in one meal to keep themselves sustained for as long as possible. And then, of course, one of my favorite of the deep sea creatures, very rare to see on blackwater dives. So I do want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. So I want to open up to questions we may have. And I've also included my website and my Instagram on the bottom. So if anyone has additional questions you think of afterwards, feel free to contact me. But yeah, if everyone has questions, feel free to ask.
That was really fantastic. What do you think is sort of your hit rate, per dive? I've only done this. I've done it in Kona. I haven't done it elsewhere, but I came up with nothing. My wife came up with something, a couple of good shots, but it's very difficult to, I don't know how that compares to what I'd see in Antelope or some other location.
Yeah, I mean, it really does depend, like night to night. Like I'll be somewhere for a week, and there may be one night where I'm gonna stare at dusk in particulate for like 2 hours, and the next night you might see a lot of different things. Kona, most of the operators tether you to the boat, so that makes it particularly difficult for photography because when you do find something, you can't then go chase after it. Like I've shot photos as deep as 124 feet, so it's probably a little bit harder in Kona than in other places, but the hit rate is honestly, it's very seasonal as well. Like Kona has seasons as well as Florida. There's some months that might be more likely to be dead and some months where specific critters show up. So it's really hard to predict that. Antelope has a season too. So it really just depends. I think my advice would probably be to make sure you're going like in the middle of the hottest season.
All right, thank you.
I have a question. What about, like the currents, like new moon, full moon? Do you see different species at different times, or?
Yeah, so it doesn't seem at least so the friends I have in Florida, every night they dive, they record all the species they see to see if they can find patterns. Nobody's told me a whole lot about whether new moon or full moon seems to have a whole lot of relation to what they see. But one of the theories in Anilau is that if you're on an outgoing tide, you're more likely to see rare things. But I don't, it's like there's not been proven. This is just people speculating. So there's not really like, absolutely this critter only shows up at new moon, this one only shows up at full moon. There's not a whole lot of data. It's kind of more speculative.
And I have one more question. I was with a group of people who were diving in Kona, and they were doing a bioluminescence dive, and an oceanic white tip came in and was aggressive, so they had to abort the dive. Do you see things like that?
Yes, so Kona in particular is really known for having that problem because oceanic white tips are kind of always around. And so that's Kona, the two scariest things are the oceanic white tips and the cookie cutter sharks. Both of them are pretty, I wouldn't say often, but are commonly like you always have to be aware that you might see one of those show up on a blackwater dive. So that is definitely a concern, specifically in Kona. There's no big sharks in Anilau. They've like fished them all out. Florida, we do see sharks, but they're not really aggressive, so that's not a huge problem. But Florida, the biggest problem there is swordfish because they can be aggressive, and they've almost speared. They actually did spear one of my friends last month, and they've almost speared other people before too. So there are always things you have to be aware of. You have to be aware of your surroundings. Things can always show up that you need to, know what to look for.
Thank you.
Any hints about how to handle backscatter?
Yeah, so I think everyone will give you kind of different tips for that. For me, it's a lot strobe position. Some people will tell you if you put the diffusers on your strobes, you get less backscatter. I haven't really found that to be the case. I don't use diffusers because that way you can shoot faster because you can turn them up higher. For me, it's really just about strobe positioning. I keep my strobes really close and turn them out a little bit. I see some people use their strobes as wide angle. Some people, sorry, I don't turn them out. I put them in and I turn them inward, like right in front of where my dome port is. And I basically just shoot at that distance. If it's not in that distance, I'm not going to, I'm going to move in until it's at that exact distance where I'm going to get as little backscatter as possible. I don't move my strobes at all, the positioning during my dive. But it really depends again on the visibility where you are. Sometimes if it's just really bad, there's not a whole lot you can do. But again, this is why I shoot usually like very underexposed. If there's a lot of backscatter, and that way, and then I'll just bring out the subject in post.
So do your video lights, do they shut off when your strobe fires?
No.
No? Okay.
Even when they're on red, though, the strobes usually overpower them. There's a few scenarios where the red might come through, but it's usually not the case. The main one I have as the focus light, that one points right in front of my port. The one I'm using as a scoping light, it's not pointed into where my port would see. So only the light from the focus light would even be in the field of view of the camera.
And those focus light, are those like 8,000 lumen lights then?
On flood mode, yes. On spot mode, it's 2,600.
Okay. But the 8,000 lumens is what you're using for your focus light then, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that way I can see what's in my what I'm looking at in the camera. I think Helga has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. What is the size of these critters?
So that varies a lot. Some things are like a few millimeters. Some things can be, if it's like an inch or 2 inches is considered large, but blanket octopus can be a foot up to like 6 feet. So, but really generally, I would say an inch or less is what you're going to be looking at for the most part.
And do you have anything in your mask to magnify the size of the critter
No, I judge.
so you can see?
No, honestly, half the time I don't even know what I'm looking at. Like half the time I'm just like taking photos and I look at it in the photo in the camera afterwards. It's even if you had a magnifier, it would be difficult because everything's moving some of these things are moving very, very quickly. The things that aren't moving quickly, you can just go in and look at. But the things that are moving really quickly, a lot of times you have to just take photos and then figure out what it is afterwards. A lot of times I don't even know if I'm in front of the head of the critter or not because it's moving so erratically. It is partly luck. Sometimes you're going to miss a lot of shots. And it's also the case, like with pretty much all other critters, that some individuals are a lot more cooperative than others. So you might find one lionfish that, like this in the bottom right, here's a lionfish. You might find one that just immediately turns away and runs away. And then you might find another one that might freeze for a little bit. So if you find one subject and it's really not cooperating, usually I just move on and go to something else. But a lot of how I'm judging what a critter is by the way it moves in the water. Like if the more you you do blackwater diving, the more you'll be able to see something from really far away and be like, oh, that's a sea butterfly. Oh, that's a nudibranch. And then you can decide, do I want to go closer and look at it or not?
Thank you.
Yep.
Just curious, is that a Florida lionfish or a Antelope or something?
Yes, this lionfish is Florida. Larval.
And maybe another question while I'm unmuted. Do you see many people trying to do video? I mean, it seems to be as difficult as it was to focus on film. I mean, sorry, on stills. I'm more of a video person anyway, but I didn't even attempt the video portion. With the depth of field limitations, it seems like it'd be really difficult, but there's people doing it, huh?
A lot of people doing that are actually using wide angle lenses. It makes it a lot easier. They'll use the MWL that I have, they'll use that all the time. They're just shooting fisheye, or they'll shoot using, again, the WWL on mirrorless cameras. That gives much better results for video to be shooting wide angle.
All right, may have to buy one of those.
But yeah, like I know people like like Mike Bartik, I think he's given a talk before. I don't know what he's shooting. I think he's still using his D850. He'll use a macro to wide angle converter when he's doing his video, and his video comes out very well.
Well, he does get lots of opportunities, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a big part of it too. Like the people with the best videos and photos are the ones who live in Florida, who live in NLL, who get to go out every night.
Any more questions for Kat?
So Helga had one earlier in the chat. As she said, if plankton drifts with the currents, how does it move up and down from the depths?
Yeah, so this is actually not 100% understood. I've tried to look this up before. The best answer that I've been able to find is that well, some plankton have limited move. Like for example, jellyfish is planktonic, but it can move, it just moves slowly. One of the theories is that because there's so many things moving, that actually causes everything else to move. It's not even things that can't move on their own, because the water is moving from all these jellyfish moving, that causes them all to go up as well. So it's kind of like a compounded effect where the more things are moving, the faster everything goes up. I don't like that was the best answer I could get. There's not like 100% agreed on answer for that question, as far as I could tell.
Is there more stuff up after midnight or after X amount of hours?
I don't think so. That doesn't seem to be the case, because on nights I've done like 2 or 3 blackwater dives in a row, it doesn't seem that there's much more going on in the later dives than in the earlier dives. It just it's you
Well,
never
how
know.
early do you start?
Right after sunset. Generally everything is moving at sunset, and by like nighttime, I think most things are probably up.
Well, it must not be moving very far.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly like what depth everything is coming from to where, but like, for example, the water we dive in Florida is 750 feet. So at most it's moving 750 feet. And some of these things can move pretty quickly. Like not all of them don't move. Like jellyfish can move, I think, faster than you might imagine when they really want to. Siphonophores definitely can move faster than you might imagine.
Do you have videos on your website?
I don't. I don't take video. I only take photos for Blackwater specifically. My camera setup's not really. I I haven't really tried, and I'm not very good at it.
Okay, thank you.
But I can give you the accounts of some people who do take video. Chris Goog in Florida takes a lot of video, and Mike Bartik as well from Analau. Both of those are good resources.
Can someone post that web address?
I think Goog is. Let's see if I can find his website.
I know Mike is at the Crystal Blue Resort, so if you contacted Crystal Blue Resort, you'd probably get him. He's the general manager.
Crystal Bloom?
Yeah, Mike Bartik is Crystal Blue Resort. There's also on Facebook, there's a group called Blackwater Photo Group. It's run by Mike Bartik, and it's where everyone who's Blackwater diving might post their photos and videos, and a lot of people will post videos in there as well. So this is Blackwater Photo Group. And that's a really great resource. The Blackwater Photo Group, if you're taking Blackwater photos and you need help identifying anything you find, there's a lot of like scientists who are really, really good with identification.
Do you know what the minimum looms needed for nighttime video is? Is it a lot less than
I think Mike only used one of the, I think he might only use like a 5,000 lumen, either 5,000 or 8,000. You don't need a ton.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Maybe a quick question. Have you
Nope,
seen
Brad, go ahead.
trying this in other sort of novel parts of the world where nobody's trying it, like British Columbia or something like that, or I know some people have talked about doing it in Monterey, but I haven't seen anybody doing it yet. But
yeah, the issue in doing it off of California is the white sharks.
Yeah.
Concern at night when you're diving.
That would terrify me, but some people don't care.
I think California has potential, but people aren't really trying it out for that reason. There are like Ned and Anna DeLoach have been doing like exploratory Blackwater trips to places that not a lot of people are doing. They're in discussions of doing it off of like Dominica. There's some spots I've heard of in the Bahamas that might be good. There are some people who just went to, I want to say, Papua New Guinea to do some exploratory stuff there and got like really cool stuff. It's hard to find operators. A lot of times you have to go without insurance because not all dive insurance companies will insure for this kind of diving. But if you know someone with a boat and like there are plenty of people who want to do exploratory stuff. It's more about access and having the right gear. Like you have to fly the light setups, which sometimes can be pretty hefty.
Right.
I would think if you wanted to do it here in the Monterey Bay Area, you'd do it in a cage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in Monterey, people have done some bonfire diving. I don't know about Blackwater. It wouldn't be very easy to photograph anything in a cage, though.
I've done bonfire dives, and they didn't produce really well. I mean, they didn't do great.
Yeah, I know actually like Shane Gross has been doing some exploratory stuff out of British Columbia. He's gotten like, it's not super rare, but he's doing bonfire diving and he's gotten stuff shows up. But I think to see the really rare things, you have to spend a lot of time anyways. Like Blackwater Cozumel, Robert Sandfield's been running an operation in Cozumel for the past few years. And it's only in the past like year or two that they're starting to get all the really rare stuff that has also been seen in Florida. So it's there. They just haven't seen it until recently. It's just they haven't been spending enough time, I guess. Or they haven't been looking the right way.
It was a really great presentation. And I was wondering how many Blackwater dives have you done, would you estimate?
I think each year I might do like, I don't, maybe like 20 or so per year. And I've done this for, I think 4 years, 4 or 5 years, up to 100, I guess. Probably
That's
like
great.
80, I would say.
It's neat. Yeah, really great presentation.
Thank for me.
Why do you say that there'd be a problem with great whites in Monterey?
I don't know
Are
about
they
Monterey.
attracted to the lights, or
I think it's just no, I don't think they're attracted to the lights, but you don't, it's more that because it's at night, you can't, you have like no, there's not a whole lot you can do if they show up. And
yeah?
you're out in the middle of the ocean in deep water.
Oh, that's true.
Like at least during the day, for example, like with oceanic whitetips in Hawaii, if you're out in the middle of the ocean, you can see them coming, whereas at night you can't until they're right next to you. That's kind of where the danger comes in.
Yeah, that parachute they put out on Icona, it just shows up in your peripheral vision every once in a while, and you think it's a shark, and it's not, and it's
Yeah.
nerve-wracking.
How how far offshore are you before? How far offshore do you need to be to for this?
Um, it it depends, I think, more on depth than on distance offshore. I know in Florida, where the Gulf Stream, the closest the Gulf Stream comes to the Florida coast is off of West Palm Beach, and that is 7 miles offshore. But in places like Kona, I think you're only driving like 20 minutes or something. Not as much.
Not as far, and then it's already 6,000 feet deep or something at that point.
Yeah, in Kona they do it much deeper. It's thousands of feet. In Florida, it's only we do it at like 700 feet. Because if we go over 1,000, we find there's a lot more swordfish.
So
Which
did
is
they slash someone or actually spear them?
Sorry, I couldn't quite get that. You kind of cut out a little bit. Could you repeat the question?
Did swordfish slash like a sword or stab?
Oh, they will stab you. They almost stab one person between the legs once. And then Stephen Kovacs, who's a really good blackwater photographer, he got stabbed in the leg like a month ago. And he was like bleeding. He had to get surgery to remove part of the bill from his leg.
I wonder why they do that.
I think they're just aggressive. Yeah, I don't know, but swordfish are scary. Like the other, there's nothing else that's a huge risk in the Florida area, but the swordfish are definitely something you want to avoid on Blackwater.
Okay. Unless we have any more questions, we'll thank Kat for the beautiful presentation. This was awesome.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Yeah, don't sell yourself short for not being a scientist. You seem very well informed on the biology. So
Thank you. I like really do try to, this stuff fascinates me, so I really do try to learn about it as much as I can. But I mean, if you talk to the people in the Blackwater photo group, they'll be like, oh, this appendage here means that it's one of this class and this species. And I'm totally lost with all that.
That was great.
Thanks.
Cool.
Thanks
Well,
again.
thanks for having me, though, and I hope everyone either learned something or enjoyed it.
I certainly did.
I have one more question.
Yeah,
Sure.
sure.
If if someone gave you a free camera of your choice and paid you for the learning curve, um, what what would you consider?
For blackwater photography, I would actually use the camera setup that I have right now. The D850 focuses, the D850 and the D500 are the fastest focusing cameras in this condition with the Nikon 60mm lens. I don't think there's any other setup that focuses as quickly and can focus as well using red light. So one of the issues with mirrorless cameras is that some of them, they just can't find focus in red light. And so sometimes you have to stick with white light, which kind of lowers the amount of critters you can shoot. People are doing great blackwater photography with mirrorless cameras, but the 850 and the 500 both give you more photos in focus than you would with a mirrorless. For video, though, I would use.
Okay. Yeah, what about for video?
I mean, I don't really have enough experience, I think, to name a specific camera. I think most of the mirrorless cameras do pretty well, especially because you're shooting usually with a wide angle. Um, I I know like Goog, for example, he uses the Z8. I've seen some of the other videography I see in the group is from a Z8 as well. I think like, but honestly though, I have considered getting a TG6 for video specifically. The videos I've seen from them are incredible, and it's a much smaller camera. I've thought about getting one as like a secondary camera and just carrying it around. Um, I mean, I don't have experience with it, but there are a lot of people taking like amazing video using and photos using the TG6 and TG7 now.
Oh, wow. That's good to know.
Yeah, it seems to me to be easier to learn how to use for video than like a Z8.
So the Olympus users, do you know how many lumens they're using?
I'm not sure. I think I think most of them are using around like 5 to 10,000 you with per light, but I'm not the expert on video, so I'm not completely sure. But I know like it's not more if it's 5,000, it's not more than 2 5,000s. That would be too much. My 8,000,
What
I've taken some video with my just one 8,000 light, and it's enough.
what happens if you try this eighth mile off
From Florida?
in anywhere?
Um, I, I I think again it depends more on the depth that you're at than how far you are from shore. So Florida, we go 7 miles
So you ever
specifically
tried it?
of the depth there.
Well, have you ever tried it in shallow water?
Yes. Yeah, they've tried. I was not there. This like 7 years ago was when everyone started blackwater diving in Florida. They tried like every depth. They tried 500 feet, 600 feet, 700 feet, 800 feet, 1,000 something feet, and they found 750 was the hot spot where it was the sweet spot there. I don't think everywhere else they've done that kind of trying. I know like my friend Steven has done some of it in Anilau. He's just gone up and tried different depths. He tried it in Tulumban as well, not with much luck. But it does take a process of really like trial and error.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Kat. Fantastic presentation. Lots of great questions from everyone. So thank you for doing this for us.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, now we will switch gears and do our mini comp. So I'll get that set up momentarily. So just hold on one second.